These days, you walk to a pharmacy and you might very well see an automatic blood pressure measuring device. Good idea. But if you went through a pharmacy 100 years ago, you might see this device. What is it? It's a psychograph. What were you to do with it? You'd put it on your head. And with its probes, little levers that moved in and out, it would measure the bumps on your scalp. Why would anyone want to do that? Because way back in the 1700s, physician Joseph Gall discovered that there was a relationship, so he thought, between brain activity and the contour of the skull. How did he come to this theory? Because when he was in school, he found that the smartest kid in his class had a very large forehead. And he thought that this was because he must have a large brain, and when you exercise your brain, this is reflected with bumps on the skull as the brain grows. And this became a huge deal. The subject is known as phrenology. And phrenologists were all over the place 100 years ago, measuring the contours of the scalp of people and telling them what they should do, because the belief was that if they were thought to have a skull that reflected lower intelligence, then they could be given advice on how to improve their intelligence. You know, people like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle bought into this, maybe because he himself had a very large forehead. And it is really interesting that in the Sherlock Holmes stories, he portrayed Professor Moriarty, Sherlock Holmes' archenemy, as having a very large forehead and therefore supposedly a very active brain. And of course, Holmes himself had a very large forehead and supposedly as large a brain as Moriarty. Anyway, this belief became widespread. And amazingly, it wasn't actually studied scientifically until just a few years ago, with a proper study that was published in a medical journal. What is the research that they did here? Well, they took data from the UK Biobank study, which took MRI scans of thousands of people. And these people also filled out questionnaires about their personality traits. So the researchers were able to compare the shape of the skull to these personality traits. And what they discovered was that, of course, there was no relation. So now we have scientific evidence to put phrenology into the area of pseudoscience. And it's difficult for us to believe that 100 years ago, people would set store by this stuff. They would use diagrams like this, which depicted the different areas of the brain where supposedly traits were centered. It was all nonsense, of course, but we have to give those old phrenologists some credit, because they did introduce the idea that the brain was compartmentalized and that different traits could be located in certain parts. Of course, it is not reflected in the shape of the skull, but there is obviously truth to the brain being compartmentalized. We know this. We know that speech is located in one part of the brain, etc. But today, of course, phrenology is in the garbage heap of science, but there are still some people who believe in it. I would say they should go and have their head examined.